Excellency is a contradiction in terms. There's an excellency and a comrade. Ambassador Cuba here, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, my dear fellow students. Fidel is no more, but he will continue to remain an inspiration for all revolutionaries, I think, to all freedom-loving people, peace-loving people the world over. I say Fidel continues to live on and he'll continue to live on, not only for revolutionaries but for all freedom-loving people in the world, and who want a world without exploitation and who want a world where there will be proper human dignity. The reason I say this is not because of what Fidel and Che and the band of revolutionaries, Cuban revolutionaries represent. After all, a revolution cannot but be romantic. It has to be romantic. And Fidel, I can say, all through his life continued to remain a romantic hero. Fidel and Che always symbolized that. But revolution is not only a romance. It's not only a romantic episode. It is actual grim reality and a grim struggle. And there are these attributes of Fidel which will immortalize his memory and will serve as a source of inspiration. And I would like to just mention 4 or 5 of them. Prabhat has spoken about, and the ambassador, comrade, has spoken about the proletarian internationalism, which is an essential part of Marxism, and what has happened in Angola. But that proletarian internationalism was also to be seen, as the ambassador mentioned, in Latin America. It was the Cuban Revolution that actually put forward the concept of imperialism versus Bolivarism, or Simón Bolívar and the liberation of the continent of Latin America, and which actually was the source or the fountainhead of a lot of these movements, which eventually led to the victory through democratic elections of left governments in various countries in Latin America. That's why at the memorial, where I had the opportunity to be on the 29th at the Jose Marti Square of the Revolution in Havana, it was Rafael Correa who started the tributes, and it was Maduro who ended the tributes. And the whole of Latin America, you could actually see them there paying homage to Fidel. Now, for the fact that it was Cuban Revolution was the fountainhead of inspiration of whatever anti-imperialist resistance that you find in Latin America today, that is also taken institutional forms of forming various institutions to resist imperialist domination of Latin America, and that struggle continues and will continue to go on. That is one attribute. But the Havana that we saw on the 29th, 3 days ago, was not the Havana that I'm used to, having been there a couple of times earlier. You had the whole of the city, and in fact half of Cuba, which had traveled there to Havana that day. The streets were full. There was grief, there was agony, but at the same time there was a revolutionary spirit that was there in the slogans that were being shouted. And Cuba is a place where you always had fun, gaiety and music. Yeah, Batista is there. He's come back, isn't it? Anyway, but Cuba is the place. Cuba is the place where you find a lot of gaiety, even on the streets, on loudspeakers. You would have music blaring, people dancing on the streets, and you would have a lot of revelry that's going on. But for once, everything was stopped. Only to tell you, the manner and the profoundness of the grief was such that there's a famous bar in Cuba that used to be frequented by Ernest Hemingway when he was there to write his Old Man and the Sea. It's called La Bodejita, where he would have his margarita, so to speak, or mojito. Mojito, that is it. Mojito. In over 2 centuries, that bar was closed. and said it will remain closed till the 4th of next month, December. After 2 centuries, I said, why? Is it a state decree? He said, no. Voluntarily, every bar, every music, this thing had all shut down, and they remained shut till the 4th. Not because of a state order, not because of a state decree, but how the people felt. That was Fidel in Cuba, for Cuba. Fidel for the world, you see, one attribute of all-time internationalism, I said that we keep his memory and his inspiration alive. The second, as a revolutionary, what one must understand, the lesson that Fidel drew after the failed revolution of 1953. And that is why that revolution is a praxis. Praxis is theory and practice, where neither gets the supremacy over the other. It's a dialectical relationship where you learn from each other, enriching both. 53, a band of guerrillas go. Revolution fails. Then the realization and the learning process begins that through bands of guerrillas, a revolution can never succeed unless it has popular support. And then you have Fidel and the comrades branching out to all the plantations, sugarcane plantations, mobilizing the virtually bonded labor, slave labor, going into the few factories that are there, talking about workers' participation in the management on floor shops, mobilizing the workers and the peasants, so when they come back in 59, they succeed because of that popular support. So the lesson to be drawn through this practice of the revolution is without popular support, no revolution can ever succeed, forget sustaining it. But that was not all. But Fidel, as a good Marxist, he would always be thinking and learning on his feet. And this, one could see this happening when at last I had the opportunity to meet him once along with Comrade JNUSU in '93, when we had detailed discussions. I met him earlier, but this time there was a long, detailed discussion. It was a very, very strange incident in the sense that JNUSU, I was accompanying Comrade JNUSU and we were there on a visit, and it was at about 11 o'clock when both of us retired. JNUSU changed into his night clothes, went off to sleep. Suddenly we got a knock on the place where we were staying, saying that the commandant is waiting. So Jyoti Babu in that old days, that commandant is waiting. At 11 o'clock we were taken to meet Fidel. Meeting that lasted till 2 in the morning. And there when he entered, we saw him, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The Time carried, I remember traveling to Cuba, on its cover page, it said Castro's Cuba, end of a dream. So it was all presumed that Cuba would collapse. And that was the period when we were there and we saw Castro poring over maps of locating where are all the nickel deposits, which the Cubans called red dust. The nickel deposits were there, saying that now we have to survive on our own, so we have to diversify our production. Soviet imports are not going to keep us alive. So how do we change our economic structures? Because till then they were completely dependent on imports from the Soviet Union. So the concrete analysis of the concrete conditions, the living essence of dialectics, as Lenin told us, that concrete analysis, concrete conditions, the conditions had changed. Cuba was all alone. It had to survive in isolation where it had nothing else except sugarcane till then, and therefore sugar and rum. Beyond that, nothing else. So how does this economy survive? And then the process of the diversification that's happening and learning there on the feet. And that is a quality which is a very, very important quality for a revolutionary to have. And that is accompanied with that concrete analysis of concrete conditions was also the other quality of the attention to the detail. JNUSU and Comrade Fidel were talking, various things were discussed, international situation, Soviet collapse, etc., etc. Suddenly Fidel started asking, he said, how much steel does India produce? How many tons? how much cement, how much of your land is arable, how much is it irrigated. And naturally, I mean, you wouldn't expect Jyoti Basu to have all these answers on his fingertips, and that too at 2 in the morning. And therefore, then Fidel turned to me and then he said, young man, I can understand. He's older than me, Jyoti Basu, so he won't have this, but you must have all this at the fingertips. I was totally ashamed, honestly speaking. Completely ashamed, saying that, such simple things. And what it means to be a revolutionary, that attention to the detail. After that, I've been to Cuba. This was the third time, day before yesterday. By reflex, I carry a small handbook of statistics with me, just in case Fidel would ask me again. But this attention to the detail was something that will always, make all of us not merely remember Fidel, but also keep reminding us that you cannot be a true revolutionary unless you have at least these three attributes that I pointed out. And the fourth one, not only compassion, humanism, etc. As Marx had once said, nothing human is alien to me. And that is what was Fidel again. He symbolized that nothing human was alien to him. Music, dance, and what Prabhat was talking about in this huge park when you have the May Day celebrations, etc. He would have all these kegs of rum there, which just, anybody can open the taps and keep having as much as they want. But I mean, all these, but there was also a dynamism in what was the check against the sort of an ossification of the revolution that can possibly occur. And that is what Fidel encouraged. Cuban cinema, for instance. Cuban cinema, for instance, was one of the worst critiques of how socialism in Cuba was being practiced. And some of the most brilliant, cinematographically, some of the most brilliant films came out of that approach. I don't know if many of you have seen, in those days in JNU, we would see this, there was a wonderful a film called The Death of a Bureaucrat. In Cuba, how a worker dies, and the whole story is about making mockery of the Cuban administration and saying that you learn and stop doing the mistakes of falling into the trap of the bureaucracy, where a worker dies, but his wife can't get his pension because his identity card is not there. The identity card has been buried with the worker as a mark of honor and respect to him because he was a good worker. So if the identity card is buried and it's in the grave, until you get the identity card, he can't get the pension. But the grave can't be opened because that's blasphemy. I mean, you can't do that. So how do you circumvent that? The whole thing was about that. And it was a learning process for the Cuban administration, the society, of how to keep constantly improving. There was this very touching movie called Up to a Point, Women's Equality under Socialism. He said, yes, we are equal, but only up to a point. And the fight against matriarchal values, the fight against that sort of an oppression, all this coming through cinema, Cuban art, Cuban paintings. I mean, this was all a creative form, a form of creative expressions whereby the apparatchik, as the Soviet Union and in the places that we called off, I mean, to prevent the possibility of such a sort of a thing from emerging, you had a dynamic society that was allowed to flourish, and flourish to the extent of questioning, and questioning very fearlessly many things and the decisions that the state would take or the leaders would take, and to discuss with them. And another thing which Fidel put in practice, which is why he'll remain forever a source of inspiration, was that finally the power is with the people. Remember, when Lenin gave the slogan of all power to the Soviets were not Communist Party organizations. They were organization of the people. The communists would have to go into the Soviets, convince everybody of the line, debate, discuss, and through that fierce debating and discussion, etc., come to a commonality and a common position. But once that was abandoned, and it became through a fiat or a decree, that you see that contributed eventually to the collapse of socialism. But here in Cuba, you'd have, the moment you have your party committee taking a decision, people going off into their local committees, local communes, local bodies, and then discussing with everybody that this is what the party proposes. So everybody in Cuba is involved in that decision-making process. Everybody. And that is how this entire process of that involvement and being a live organism, that revolution is a live organism. And if you want to keep that revolution alive, its life has to be enriched, and enriched in every sphere, whether it's art, whether it's aesthetics, whether it's education. And therefore, the sort of excellence that Cuba achieved, even through the worst of the criminal embargo of Cuba by the US, USA was sending, and graciously Fidel was accepting, US doctors to come and learn from Cuba on neurosciences and surgical operations to cure, or at least to tackle or to prevent further degeneration from diseases like the Parkinson's, etc. They have made these advances, and for instance, they were the first to bring out the vaccine against hepatitis. I remember Fidel offering Jyotibasu, saying that those days they used to sell it for 5 rupees. It used to be 3 vaccination doses, $5. He said, for your West Bengal, I'll give it to you for 50 cents. So we had to go into great this thing to explain to him West Bengal is only one part of India. You see, until you have to come through India, the Indian government, that didn't. Anyway, so obvious. So, I mean, these sort of advances that the Cubans did, it may look amazing, a tiny country. And if India were to send, as one of our former ambassadors to the United Nations had calculated, if India had to send the number of troops that Cuba sent to Angola or to South Africa, then it would be something like 7 million troops, armed troops, we would have had to send as a proportion of the population. So education, culture, art, everything, it was a dynamic society that was built. So that is why Fidel's loss today is felt by everybody in Cuba. Is felt not because that every human has to go one day, everybody knows that. So it was also in a sense a celebration of Fidel's life, but also the grief was the expression of the determination that we'll continue to carry forward. And Fidel himself said, I mean, I was there to hear it from him, saying that nobody would have wagered a cent that Cuba would have survived after the Soviet collapse. But we have, because of that determination and the education and the higher level of consciousness of the Cuban people. That's it. I was there at the worst period of Cuba, that was from 92 to 94. We were there in 93. There was no petrol, there was no food, there was no soap. When the CPM had organized, and then we had sent at that time a shipload of grain and detergent. So Fidel invited Comrade Surjit to come there to receive that ship. So when we were there, Fidel said that we'll call this the Surjit soup and the Surjit bread. And Surjit said, please don't, because it's neither mine nor anybody, because the people of India had contributed. And it was a massive program through which we'd sent that. That was the stage of Cuba then in 92, 91, 92, 94. Rationing. People didn't have, there was no fuel. But then see the way it's bounced back today. To be again the fulcrum of the progressive revolutionary movement in Latin America. And that is the Cuba that we salute today. And that is why Fidel will forever continue to be a source of inspiration, because of all these qualities which are exceptional to be brought together into one human being. And that is what Fidel was, and that is why the world misses him. But I'm sure Cuba is more steeled and determined than the Cuban people to carry forward and further strengthen socialism there. So with that expression of solidarity to our Cuban comrades and our grief, we once again say Viva Fidel. He is physically not with us, but he will remain a source of inspiration. Thank you.
Down, down capitalism.
Up socialism.
Down capitalism.
Down imperialism.
Up socialism.
Down imperialism.
Up socialism.
Fidel Castro ko salam.
Lal salam, lal salam.
Cuba Sadio ko salam.
Lal salam, lal salam.
Latin America Sadio ko salam.
Lal salam, lal salam. We salute, red salute to comrade.
One solution.
Revolution.
One solution.
Revolution.
Source the bolo ek solution.
Revolution.
Pueblo unido como será vencido.
The people united shall always be victorious.
El pueblo unido como será vencido.
The people united shall always be victorious.
So Ho Chi Minh.
We shall fight, we shall win.
And Marx, Lenin, Bhagat Singh.
We shall fight, we shall win.
Bhagat Singh.
We shall fight, we shall win.
Fidel Castro's head king.
We shall fight, we shall win.